latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. Good evening and welcome. I'm Surya Gangadharan. As many of you are aware, China's President Xi Jinping was in Moscow where he met President Putin. They had talks. A joint statement was issued, which is interesting from many points of view. I've prepared a small graphic just to sum up what this joint statement was about, and so you're also clear about where the talks are heading. Call for talks to resolve the conflict, and Russia said it is ready for peace talks. That is on Ukraine. The statement urged respect for security concerns of all countries. And both countries will oppose raising of the Ukraine crisis at the G20 summit. As you're aware, G20 is primarily an economic and development forum. And the statement called for an open and inclusive Asia-Pacific security system while opposing the Western-led Indo-Pacific strategy. And finally, the Quad was described as a closed and exclusive group structure without, of course, naming it. I have with me Pankaj Saran. He's been on our show before. He was Deputy National Security Advisor until recently. He was also an ambassador to Russia. Sir, welcome. Glad to have you again.
Thank you, Surya. Great to be back again with you. Thank you.
So, what's your reading of the joint statement? China seems to have been pretty circumspect on Ukraine. And is that also your reading?
Well, I think the visit, of course, is very typical of Russia-China summits in terms of its aplomb and its pompous and showmanship. And, they had hours and hours of talks between the two leaders in one-on-one and restricted and full delegation talks. It was given big publicity in both countries. So, and it was his first visit after his election as the president for the third time.
Yes.
And it was also a first visit to Russia after a long time by President Xi Jinping. So, and of course, it took place within the context of Ukraine and many other developments. So I would say that, yes, this is a significant visit, but it is not unusual for Russia-China summits in terms of its, showmanship and in terms of its atmospherics. There is on Ukraine, the positions actually are not very surprising. The Chinese peace proposal is on the table. He tried to sell it to Russia. I think Russia made polite noises about how it would be a good, and it is a good prescription. But the assertion by both sides, and particularly China, on respecting the security concerns of all sides could probably be a non-starter when it comes to the West. I really don't see the peace proposal making much headway in the West, because if it succeeds, then China would actually come across as a real statesman of the world, which has succeeded in solving an extremely intractable and difficult historical dispute and confrontation. Now, whether the West would like to give this opportunity to China to come up with this and kind of in some ways assume this mantle of the global peacemaker and therefore enhance its image and standing among the rest of the world is an open question. So let's see. I do not visualize any early success, but clearly the relationship is too valuable for both sides for Russia to dismiss the Chinese proposal. So I think lip service was paid. I do not believe either side actually is convinced that peace can be achieved on the principles that the Chinese have set out, because everything else in the statement is not actually is slightly discordant with the hand of peace which China and to some extent Russia seem to be stretching out towards the West.
Do you think Russia is open to the idea of peace talks at some point? I mean, they seem to have achieved what they wanted. They seem to have. What's your sense?
No, it's difficult to predict, but I think Russia believes it is sitting pretty, both on the battlefield as well as in terms of its objectives of the occupation of that sliver of territory along eastern Ukraine.
Yeah.
They also probably feel that there is hardly any prospect for Ukraine to retrieve those territories by force. So, at some stage, the Russians would be ready for peace talks. The question, of course, remains how you can square a very difficult circle
Yeah.
of, on paper, of adhering to the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity on the one hand, and the security concerns of Russia on the other hand. So, unless you come up with a very imaginative and a creative proposal, which some of the peacemaking and think tanks in Europe are already grappling with, what could be possible outlines, it would be difficult. But I think Russia would be ready for peace talks. So we would have a duality of reality. One is that on the surface, we will continue to hear hardline positions by both sides. But at the lower level, at the back channel level, and at other invisible levels, there could be dialogue, discussion, facilitation to try and find some formula which can be sold to the respective constituencies on both sides.
Mhm. There's also the fact that Ukraine would have to be persuaded, but perhaps that may not be too difficult.
You know, the Ukrainian attitude to the war has to be seen in two levels. One is what Ukraine itself feels about Russia and about its geographical location, and the
Mhm.
other is what it is advised by its European and the other NATO partners. If the advice given to Ukraine and to the president of Ukraine is to try and wind it down, that's one thing. But if the advice is that you carry on the fight until you vacate every inch of Ukraine from Russian forces, that's another scenario. I am not sure whether the Europeans and the NATO themselves are clear about this whole situation, because one of the dilemmas, that one of the manifestations of this dilemma is the kind of weaponry that is being supplied to Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so there is an informal kind of a ceiling beyond which the lethality of weapons is not going to Ukraine. So we have seen things like ammunition or short range weaponry or traditional artillery or defensive weapons, but we are not yet seeing, in terms of sophisticated armories and weaponry, going into Ukraine. But it's clear that Ukraine is going to be heavily dependent on the advice given to it, apart
Yeah.
from its own internal and nationalistic sentiments. So that really is, the jury still out on which direction this turns in the next, let us say, from now as we enter the summer months till the end of, or to the start of the winter later this year, after maybe 7, 8 months.
Mhm. Now, I want to broaden the chat a bit and look at the references to the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. You know, I mean, these are not new statements, especially coming from Russia, but they've been incorporated in the joint statement. And what is your sense of this?
Firstly, I would say it's Indo-Pacific and it's a Quad, and also it is the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US most recent grouping that has been formed 2 years ago. So I think AUKUS is very, very much part of this whole reference to small groups being constructed, which are exclusive and detrimental to security. So that's on the one hand. Secondly, I would say we need to look at this from this kind of a burden sharing approach, which is that Russia is under threat in the European theater, and China is under threat in the Indo-Pacific theater. And therefore, and given the fact that a few years ago, under the Trump administration, the US national security strategy had very clearly laid out, which is followed up by the Biden people, that both Russia and China are going to be the focus of US national security strategies. So in that eventuality, there is little option for Russia and China but than to come together and to basically implicitly signal that China will act as some kind of a provide some kind of a strategic support to Russia when it comes to the threats Russia faces in Europe. And Russia will likewise also be empathetic or sympathetic or supportive to China's perceived threats in the Indo-Pacific. So there is a geographical balance of strategic calculations out here, which is why we see that Ukraine is there as the current live theater, but both, and particularly China, sees the Indo-Pacific as an emerging and fast-growing theater for actions targeted at China. So I would see it more in that sense. The Russian position on the Quad and the Indo-Pacific has been conveyed to us, and they obviously oppose it. Yeah. We know the Chinese position. But what they have done, in a sense, in a de facto manner, they have now put it in a de jure fashion by codifying this issue. But I think while this is clearly in response to what we are seeing in Ukraine and what the Chinese are seeing when it comes to the Taiwan case in the last, say, 12 to 18 months, in the longer term, we will have to see how much of this kind of balance and how much of this partnership progresses when it comes to actions on the ground by both sides. Because I would like, the fact of the matter is that the Chinese integration with exactly those European powers and the United States, with whom Russia is under severe stress today, China's integration with them is so deep and so entrenched that whereas China is a global player and has global stakes, most importantly, in those countries which are Russia's adversaries, whether in Europe or the United States, Russia does not have similar integration and stakes in the Indo-Pacific region. There is an asymmetry out here. And I do not see the Chinese easily, but of course, when it comes to the crunch, they may do it. But I do not see them in the normal course sacrificing this relationship that they have with Europe and the United States very easily.
So it's basically opportunistic. Both have short-term tactical goals, strategic goals to be realized, perhaps?
I think so. I think we need to distinguish between short-term tactical, the current Ukraine conflict, and a much more longer-term strategic direction in which the Russia-China relationship is progressing. I think that's really important for us to differentiate. Because remember, this is also the picture we are seeing on the other side of the line, which is, for example, the revival of NATO, the emergence of a stronger European Union. But, even in that case, for example, if you take the European Union, there are very major differences within the European Union on how to deal with Russia in the long term. Today, we are dealing with the short term. So similarly here on Russia-China, for example, yes, there is a short-term expediency and a strategic exigency which brings them together, and they really do not have much of a choice. But in the long term, we have to see which direction and how this evolves in terms of how China deals with its relationships with third countries and how Russia deals in its relationships with third countries. So the question will be how China deals with, say, for example, India, and how Russia deals, say, for example, with India, and how these relationships impact on their bilateral relationship. Similarly, in Central Asia, we have to see how the Russian interests and the Chinese interests either converge or not converge in Central Asia. There are certain contradictions which cannot be papered over, but these are more long term. As I said, for the immediate, it is a strategic exigency and a strategic convenience for them to say what they have said. Uh, if you look at the comments and statements on both sides during this current visit, they're actually not saying anything really new in
Yeah.
terms of in terms of describing the relationship and how strong it is, and so on and so forth. We've heard these in the past also. I think this is more an opportunity for both leaders to come together, to stand shoulder to shoulder, to some extent, for China to express solidarity with Russia, and for Russia to say that, look, tomorrow you might face similar problems in Taiwan, and
Yeah.
I am going to be there also with you. So there is a mutuality of interest that comes out from this visit. But whether it breaks new ground, whether it is taking these two countries to the next level of a classical military or a political alliance in the traditional sense, we are getting one step closer, but we are not yet there because of
Mhm.
these and other contradictions which I have referred to.
In that also reduces our options, doesn't it? We are increasingly forced to be with one set of people because of this dynamic being played out with the Russians and the Chinese.
Yes, I mean, to that extent, India's positions are going to be more difficult because if the U.S. Europe on the one hand and the Russia China on the other hand fault lines harden, and we go closer and closer towards some kind of a division of the world into some kind of quasi alliances. Naturally, expectations from both sides on countries like India and indeed the rest of the world will grow. But I would say that uh, we have to, therefore, it's all the more important for us to be able to step back a little bit, take a kind of a enlightened view on what we should be doing with whom. We have to remember that Russia and India really do not have bilateral disputes. We do not have a common border.
Yeah.
The question is, what happens in the eventuality of, let's say, an India-China standoff or a confrontation? What happens if the West versus Russia-China confrontation increases? The problem in that is that we do not really actually have control
Yeah.
over escalation of tensions between the West and the Russia-China axis. And what we actually have to be saying to the Western world is that it is important for us to at least have some strategic convergence and consensus that in the years ahead, in the medium to long term, the threat that comes to the current world order is actually from China,
Hmm.
and it is not from Russia. If we do not have that degree of consensus on this kind of a slightly basic um, situation or a scenario, then it becomes very difficult for us to navigate our way through. So this is, some of the complexities that we face. Um, if Also, I think the Indian planners, also when they, go through the choices before them, and they, work on one scenario where, for example, for different reasons, Russia feels somehow politically and strategically tied to the Chinese positions on, let's say, the India-China issue, or on Chinese positions, then obviously we are in a bad situation. I mean,
Yeah.
we would not like. So if you look at the map of Eurasia, one scenario could be where we not only have an unfriendly China, but we also have an unfriendly Russia.
Russia.
And for India to then handle both these powers, which are unfriendly or which are not well disposed, is going to be clearly a very serious challenge. And in that case, you narrow your strategic options. I mean, then, you know, you have to choose how to, and you have to decide how to handle this threat.
In all this time, have you seen anything there to suggest that the Russians are beginning to view us differently? Perhaps their attitude to us is increasingly being colored by the Chinese?
You know, Surya, that's a good question, and that is something which Indian planners keep a very close watch on. Evidence so far shows that this is not the case. In other words, that despite the Russia-China relationship, Russia has been very careful to continue its uh, policies and its partnership with India. In fact, if you read the India Russia joint statements, and if you look at the visuals and the images of India Russia summits, they are equally grand. But of course, you know, you have to remember that India is not a Security Council member, it is not a global power.
Yeah.
So we have to accept that reality of asymmetrical power. But having said that, you know, what are the metrics on which you base Russian goodwill and intent towards India? For example, their position on Kashmir.
Yeah.
For example, their attitude towards the India-China conflict. For example, their readiness to sell high technology weapons to you despite their relationship with China. You know, their willingness to partner with you in nuclear technology. Now, we always keep assessing whether they are looking behind their back to China before they enter into these kinds of sensitive areas of cooperation with India. So far, we have not been able to detect any hesitation on the part of Russia. So, as I said, Russia too is a global player in a certain sense, not in a certain well defined sense, but they are unlikely to mortgage their entire Asia Pacific policy to China. And they will keep India in play. And it is interesting that both sides have made, you know, repeated references to the BRICS grouping in these
Yeah.
joint statements, and it's not the first time. They always do it. So in a sense, actually, India has featured, you know, in these documents. I think similarly, the Russia, India, China grouping has featured in these documents. Similarly, it's interesting that when the documents talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, you would notice that in the same breath, they also talk about the Eurasian Economic Union.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, they want to kind of ensure that their respective initiatives are on par with each other, and neither is given primacy vis-a-vis the other. So, if it is a BRI, then you also talk about the Eurasian Union. You know, so they want to maintain parity there. So I feel that uh, but you know, this is a ground to be watched. I mean, as we go forward, and I think we are at a point in time because of Ukraine where there is a sharper edge to rhetoric, to public posturing, to signaling, and whether this is the new norm, we have to wait and see. And unfortunately, which way this goes, a lot of it, or some of it at least, is beyond our control.
So, when you look at the Russia-China relationship right now, where the two are very close, would you say what is it that would tilt the balance in that sense, in favor of China? Where would you see that happening?
I think, you know, economically, clearly, China is the stronger power. But even economically, for China, from China's point of view, Russia is far less significant to China than Europe or the United States.
Yeah.
That is clear. Russia is important for China only from the point of view that it fuels China's economic growth through raw materials and energy. The tilting of the balance will also depend on how China positions itself in the rest of the world, by which I mean Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, West Asia. Clearly, China's footprint is far stronger and greater than Russia's is.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the Chinese influence on developments and its presence, if it continues to grow, including in the United Nations, in, for example, issues such as the funding of the UN, in terms of its staffing of the UN, in terms of its influence in the WHO or other UN organs, clearly there is going to be a tilt in favor of China in the global balance of power. And I think the Russians realize this. And I think the Chinese also know it, but they're just being nice to the Russians to make them feel good about themselves. But I mean, frankly, the writing is more or less on the wall that unless Russia does really something really dramatic, we are going and heading towards a stronger and stronger China in all senses of the term. The only thing which Russia has in its favor are those massive nuclear forces and that nuclear parity with NATO. But minus that, the tilt, I would say, is probably already in favor of China.
So, last question: if the war were to end in the next few months, you would presume that things would start to improve.
Improve for whom?
I mean, if the fighting in Ukraine were to end, say, in the next few months.
No, we have to ask ourselves whether ending the fight early is in China's interest or not. What would China like? That's the real issue. Would China like this thing to end, or would China like this to go on? And at one level, obviously, I think it is more comfortable if there is a closure to this earlier rather than later. Because, but the other thing they also know is that even if there is a closure on Ukraine, I think we have now walked too far down the path to see that China is clearly going to be the next on the radar, especially when it comes to Taiwan. And so China knows this. And so China is preparing for that eventuality. And everything it is doing today is intended to harden itself against an impending and a likely Western kind of strategic onslaught against China. And that is what it is actually, I think. So China has a medium to long-term perspective on its confrontation with the West. Russia today is embroiled in the immediate and the tactical. I think that is really the difference in the approaches between the two sides.
Before we end, I think we have a question from a viewer. If could just put it on. Yeah.
Yes, on the question of supplies, I think if Chinese supplies military supplies to Russia, so for two parts. Number one is for the weapons to actually travel from the Russia-China or the China to the European theater on the Ukraine border is not easy. I mean, you're talking of 10 time zone differences, and what kind of weapons would actually go to Ukraine or to the Russian border is really. But having said that, and even if you overcome that, logistical nightmare and probably an impossibility, it will certainly escalate tensions. So the problem with this visit and the rhetoric, etc., is that we definitely are on an escalatory path. Right now, it is verbal, it is more rhetorical, but it could, if not controlled, get into escalation on the ground. And Chinese supplies would actually add a new dimension to the whole conflict. That's the first thing. On the second thing of decoupling, this is not happening. It is not happening in the next 2 years or 5 years. It is not happening. It is going to be a gradual tapering off, but it's going to take many, many years for China to decouple with Europe and with the United States. And the Russians know it, the Chinese know it, and which is why the Chinese are playing all sides. I mean, at one level, you could even argue that they're playing even Russia against the West, because
Yeah.
everyone knows where the bread is buttered,
Mm.
and they will never ever have trade of $700 billion between Russia and China, never.
Yeah. Hmm.
So that's the other reality.
So very, very tough choices ahead, and a very tough road ahead too for all of them concerned, including India. Ambassador Saran, thank you very much. As always, great insight and great perspective. Thank you again.
Thank you, Surya. Thank you once again for having me. I'm not sure we could manage all the questions, but still.
Thank you. For those of you who joined us on this conversation, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social media, Twitter and Instagram. Thank you and good night.